Welcome guys, it is Terminator time. I hate wiring, I've told you that in the last couple videos, but I'm excited about this part. First time ever putting one of these systems in, and I'm going to do my best to video the whole process so that you guys can see how a novice, let's call it a novice install, goes. I've never done one of these systems before, but I'm excited to do this. And I'm going to do my best to video as much as I can, just so you can see how I did it. We'll see what struggles I face. This system is supposed to be incredibly easy to put in. We'll see just how easy it is. The other part of the harness I've been dealing with this car, I'm pretty much done with. Lights are working. I haven't tucked all the wires away yet. I just wanted to wait until I got all this stuff done. But I'm ready to start throwing this in, and we'll see how easy it goes. And there she is. Terminator X. I'll get you guys the part number again, the one I'm using. Here it is, 550903. It comes with instruction manual, which is very helpful for guys like me. You know, it explains what everything is, and it just starts walking you through it. So I'm going to give this a quick read and start laying this out, and we'll see what we're up against. Okay, so I started with deciding where I'm going to mount my computer, and I chose in the glove box here. I welded a piece of angle iron because I've gutted this dash. I've cut it up a few times so nothing looks like it's supposed to look on a 68 Le Mans anymore. Mounted myself a little heater box up there because I've ripped out the factory one, and for the few times I'm actually going to use it, that should provide enough heat to at least unfog my windshield. And I've decided I'm going to mount the computer right here with the lights. It's got all these little kind of like trouble indicator lights. I'm going to have them facing forward, so I open the glove box, I can see the lights, and that should work out quite well. Now, one thing I noticed with this computer is when you drop a bolt in there, you know, this is a standard, there it is, 1/8" bolt. You can't get a socket head on it once you drop that bolt in there, unless you stack a bunch of washers to keep it up like that. When you bring a 7/8 socket over, that's as far down as the socket goes, right? You can't even get on it. So you're going to want to find yourself a bolt kind of like this, even a Torx head or Allen key bit kind of head, where if it sits down in there, you don't have to worry about getting a socket on the outside of the head of the bolt. You can just go in the middle of it. That's what I'm going to do. That's just one little thing I noticed about, because it doesn't come with hardware to mount the computer, so you better have some hardware on hand. But that's where I've decided I'm going to mount it, right? Because now I can decide how long my wires have to be, how I have to run them. The power cable, that's this guy, I've already laid throughout the car because my batteries are in the trunk, and these cables were just long enough. So if you have your batteries mounted in the trunk, these will be long enough on most vehicles. One thing I don't understand is why they've got the fuse at this end and not closer to the battery, because if you do use this whole harness like I am, you know, you've got it laying throughout the car from front to back. Well, if there was an issue with, say, it rubbed through right here, it starts arcing, like that's still a good distance away from the battery. Like, I can see, you know, the potential for a fire, right? You'd want the fuse to pop right up by the battery, and that makes this whole line dead. But they've got it at this end, so they must know more than I do. but I'm not changing up anything. I'm doing it just the way they want. And another thing that doesn't make sense to me, maybe somebody can fill me in on this. Holley is adamant that it needs to be connected, you know, their power and ground directly to the battery. I've got a battery disconnect in here. You know, if there's ever a problem, boom, you hit the switch. You're supposed to kill the whole car. But how's it going to kill the whole car when that's still running directly off the battery? I don't understand that. I've read different forums online, and Holley stands by their statement that it has to be clean power directly from the battery. You don't run it through a disconnect. You don't take it off of any other kind of power source, right? Like off the starter or anything like that. They want a direct line. So that's what I'm doing. And, you know, I don't think they'll give me much problem at the track, because I'm sure they're going to run into more and more of these setups, you know, going forward, because this is becoming a pretty popular system. So I doubt my car is going to be the first time they've seen the power run from the battery bypassing the disconnect. So that's where I'm mounting this. I've already got my power cables run through the car. Now there's my 2-inch grommet I've got in the Firewall to run my harness through. And even in the book, going through the instruction manual, it says to drill a 2-inch hole in your Firewall. And I'm telling you right now, this is going to be a fight. This harness was... I'm not looking forward to this. I'll show you why. Like these plugs, these are the two that plug into the computer. They're pretty big. I'm gonna have to try and shove them through one at a time, obviously. But it's almost like they intend only that part to go through the Firewall, because I have to try and get this big relay. I took the relay off. I have to try and get that big plug, this plug. Those wires won't be hard. Got more plugs down here. This is basically the point. This is what I want inside the car, and this is what I want outside the car in the engine bay. And this sucker, this is gonna be a jerk. A 2-inch hole fills up fast when you've got this thickness of cable going in there, and the depth of that plug trying to fight their way through there at the same time. It's gonna be a fight. I'm almost wondering if it's easier for me to start shoving all these little plugs through from the other end, push all this stuff through, and not have to push this stuff through. Like if that's my halfway point, tackle all these smaller plugs. I'm gonna fight with it. I'm gonna see which way's easier, but when you drill your hole, if you can go a 3-inch hole, it might save yourself a lot of aggravation. Instructions say a 2-inch hole, but I don't know where their stopping point is, how much they actually expect you to shove through the Firewall. Guess we'll find out. And everything's nicely labeled. This plug is for my ignition coils, which I'm mounting inside the car. And what I was gonna do was I bought harness extensions that I was just gonna plug in and run back. And then I opened them up. This thing's like barely 2 feet long. So I don't think that's gonna help me much. That might get me to the Firewall, but not up inside the Firewall. So I think I'm gonna take this nice tape job off that they've got going on here, and I'm gonna pull this wiring back out of the loom, back to this point, and leave it inside the car. So I hate to take their nice tape job all apart, but I feel I'm gonna have to, because those are not long enough. So I'm gonna pull this apart, get those out, tape it back up, and fight this sucker through there, and I'll let you know if I succeeded or not. I have a feeling that all this that I did for my mass air sensor and temperature sensor here, like for the air temperature sensor, I don't think this is going to get used anymore, because I put this in when I thought I was going to be using the factory wiring harness. Now that I've got the Holley system, it can run off the MAP sensor. And on the back of the computer, you hook into your vacuum off the back of the intake using this little vacuum line, and that reads at a one bar. That's your 1 bar MAP sensor. For boosted applications like mine, you usually want to go a little higher. So I'm going to get a 2.5 bar MAP sensor for the back of the intake. That's the sensor right down there, if you can see it. On the LS1 intake anyway, it's located at the back. I can pop that out and put a 2.5 bar MAP sensor in there, and then Holley sells a little harness adapter to adapt right into that plug, labeled MAP sensor, and then this whole thing will run off the MAP sensor and not so much off the mass air. So it looks like this might have not been needed now. But at the time I put this in, I thought I was going to be using a factory setup, factory wiring harness. And that's not the case anymore. But, oh well, I can take this off and maybe try and sell it or something. And I've got extra piping. I can easily make up a new pipe here that doesn't have this in it. Well, here's my experience so far with this. It wasn't as bad as I thought. It wasn't as nice as I was hoping. Definitely, before you drill your hole through your firewall, I would go larger than a 2-inch. Go a 3-inch. If you can get a 3-inch grommet, do it. It would have made things a lot easier. Luckily for the way I'm doing it, it's not the end of the world with the way it ended up. And I'll show you how it ended up for me. So there's everything shoved through that I could get shoved through. This is the one left side coil plug that I had routed back. So the fact that it ended up inside doesn't bother me at all, because I'm mounting my coils up here somewhere anyway. But I couldn't get it through there because I ran out of space with my grommet. And I even cut the little fingers off the grommet that were in there. The little fingers that just open up. I ended up cutting most of them out just to give me more room to shove stuff through. And I couldn't get my wideband plug through there either. There's just not enough room anymore to get it through. And these other two plugs on the harness also remained inside the car, which is fine. I wanted them to stay in here anyway. This plug is going to be for the accessories and stuff. Like there's four I guess you want to call them ports or whatever, to wire in your like boost controller and stuff like that. That's going to remain in the car, which is fine, because then I can just run the individual wires out. And with the wideband plug being inside the car, what I ended up doing, so I already had a bung welded on my exhaust, and I took the O2 sensor out that I had in there, and I ran the O2 sensor provided by Holley. You have to use their wideband sensor, because a regular O2 sensor, like GM O2 sensor, apparently is different and will not work. And I ran the wire from it up through the firewall where I have all my wires coming out for my headlights. So I didn't have to drill another hole or anything. I was able to shove that wire through there because it had a smaller end on it. And then get my light situated here. That was the end of it. And it came with this adapter to the larger end of the plug. So that smaller plug that was on the wideband fit through my 1.5-inch hole over there that already had wires in it. And then I just put the adapter on it, and now the wideband will plug into that adapter, and I'm going to coil the wires and zip tie them up out of the way up here. So to have all that extra slack under the dash and not coiled up in the engine bay, I prefer it that way. I prefer it to be in here unseen. And as for everything else, I was able to shove them through one at a time from the inside out and come out here and pull it all up through. So that's everything that runs up the driver's side of the motor is where it needs to be. I've got plugs all back here. You know, there's the oil pressure sensor, cam, we got NOx sensor, all that kind of stuff, which is all pretty much at the back of the motor anyway, so that's good. There's my mass air, which is much longer than I need. And the other ignition coil, which I'll have to push back as well. But there's your cam positioning sensor. After you drop your starter down, you can get to that easy enough. You've got a ground up there on the back of your head, and same spot on the other side. So take emery cloth, or I actually took a wire wheel to this side on the end of my drill. And then on the other side I used emery cloth because I couldn't get my drill in there, to make sure you got no paint or anything or corrosion on the back. Give yourself a clean ground, because you have to ground both sides. So it actually wasn't that hard to get all the wiring fed through. Like I said, it wasn't ideal, but it worked. Harness for the injectors. So I'm going to get that all plugged in. And this should be actually pretty simple. Just plug everything in. It's all labeled. And I'm just going to pull the remaining slack back down through the firewall again, and because I'd rather have the slack inside the car than out. Okay, I found one little hiccup. Just put these down. The back of the motor here, where your oil pressure sensor is. Here is the plug for the oil pressure sensor. See it? It's a 3-pin. On the back of my LS1, because it's a Gen 3 motor, I don't know if all Gen 3s have this style, this is the oil pressure sensor. That is a single pin. It's not the same. Back when I was working on my Yukon, I put a new sensor in it. I kept the old one. See, that's a Gen 4 oil pressure sensor. So it's a good thing I kept this, because they can get pricey. But that's the first little hiccup I found with this system so far, is the LS1 harness and LS1 setup had this style oil pressure sensor, but the Holley harness has the I'm going to assume that's a Gen 4, because that's from my 07 Yukon. But other than that, everything else has plugged in fine. I've got my injector harness all plugged in and ran to the back, and you know, cam position sensors underneath the back of the Gen 3 motors, so it's back behind, sorry, under the intake on the Gen 3 motors, so it's down there at the back. Gen 4 has the cam sensors down here on the front cover. But other than that, everything else went together pretty smooth. So no real complaints. Luckily, I had one of those sensors kicking around, so I just have to toss that one in. But other than that, everything else seemed to match up just fine. Okay, another little thing I ran into here. At the front, we've got the manifold air temperature sensor wire. And I can't find anything on here to plug that into. That's because I eliminated it when I put this in. This is the sensor that was in my old intake, my cold air intake that I had. I had pulled this from the factory airbox, like from the LS1 2000 Camaro that I had. That's the sensor out of that. And I had taken it out and put it in my cold air intake. But this is the sensor they're talking about. So luckily I didn't pitch this yet. But I think I'm going to be taking this piece of piping out, getting rid of this, because I will no longer need it. There are no plugs for this in the Holley harness. So that answered my question as to whether or not I'd be using this or not. There is no plugs for it, so that's coming out. And I'm going to put another piece of pipe in there, and what I read online was this, they would like to see this in the intake. I'm not drilling into this intake to put this in there. I'm more than happy to drill into another piece of aluminum piping and put it in there and hope, because it's not threaded, hopefully me running around 14, 15 pounds of boost won't just blow this sucker out. Because you can get these things threaded, like you can tap it or whatever and thread it in. This took a lot of effort just to pull out from the old cold air intake I had over here. You know, you drill the hole tight enough, right? I had a tight hole there, and I'll put a little bead of gasket maker on it, just as basically help adhere it to it and glue it and make sure there's a nice seal. And I'm gonna pop her in that. So that's just something else that I ran into here. Okay, it's day 2, and I had a few things come in that I ordered, because even though the system's a pretty complete system, it even tells you there's a few things you have to get. And I ran into the issue with the oil pressure sensor, and there's a few other things I had to get, and I'll show you. So that's, like I showed you, that's the sensor I'm putting in for the oil pressure. Now you can get other pressure sensors or transducers like this one. This I picked up for my fuel. It's gonna roll. It's 100 psi, no name brand pressure transducer, and I'm going to use that for my fuel pressure sensor. And you can pretty much use this on your oil pressure sensor too. You just got to get a different size. Like you have to get a bushing to make that fit, because they are different sizes. This is 1/4 inch, and I already installed it, but I bought, you can mount this, some guys can mount this right on their fuel pressure regulator. I bought this guy, and what that was an AN-8 fitting with a 1/8 inch hole in the side, like port for my fuel pressure sensor. So that guy's just gonna thread in there, because there's my wire right there for it. So it works out really good for me, and the way I have this set up to put that right there. So that takes care of my fuel pressure. Now, because I'm switching to a 2.5 bar MAP sensor, here is a no-name. This costs like 25 bucks off Amazon, and because the GM one is like $100 and some odd. So I'm gonna try this, and that is the part number that you need for the 2.5 bar GM MAP sensor. And just to recap, like this, these sensors are like 20 bucks. This was like 20 bucks. It all adds up, but I mean, each piece is relatively cheap. And this is the Holley adapter harness for the MAP sensor. So to be able to use a 2.5 bar, you got to buy this adapter from Holley. There's the part number for that, 558416. This, I think it's like 35 bucks, 40 bucks. So it's not too bad. If you choose not to run a 2.5 bar and you just want to stick with the 1 bar, so you don't have to get any of that, you won't, like, I don't even know if it's necessary to plug this in, but you can. I mean, it's on the back. But you have to run a vacuum line to this blue hose out the back. It comes with different fittings, so you can run different size hoses, but that's your 1 bar. Because I'm running a 2.5 bar, I don't have to run a vacuum line to that. But one problem I ran into with this, because I have a stock LS1 intake and my sensor is on the back, the factory sensor doesn't have, like, this is the one I took out of my intake. This is the one, this is the 2.5 bar. It's got this bolt mounting hole on the side. Well, when this sits in in the car, this side right here is up against the back of the intake. But now this is there, so this won't fit. So my options, either cut this side off, or if I cut these two tabs off this side, I can flip it and it'll pop in the other way. So before I got too far ahead of myself, I made sure I put in my oil pressure sensor down there and plugged it in, and plugged in my cam sensor and knock sensor before I got too much. Basically, you start from the bottom, work your way up. So now we can see if this guy fits. Hopefully it does. Can't seem to get it in the hole. I don't know if that hole's gonna have to be drilled out a little larger. Okay, here's what I decided to do. I put the original map sensor back in its place, and I actually zip tied it on because I found that I could pull it off pretty easy. And once I get under boost, I don't know how much pressure it's gonna take to pop that out, so I put a zip tie on just to hold it in. So I'm plugging that hole. I'm not going to use it because I can't get that 2.5 bar map sensor to fit in that hole. So what I did was I took the port that came out the side of it that I'm no longer using for anything else because I'm not running a brake booster or nothing like that. So the vacuum for that will be used for my 2.5 bar map sensor, and I just use a piece of 3/8 fuel line and shoved it on as far as I can. And I don't think I have to worry about it popping off because I can't even pull that off now. It fits pretty tight, both ends. So I don't think it'll pop off. And then down actually on this side, I had another vacuum line down there that I won't be using, so I plugged that off and put a zip tie on it, and hopefully that doesn't blow off either. But it's all learning experience. If anybody has a better idea to plug those, I'd like to know. Because I also plugged one down here, and I gotta put a zip tie but right there as well, another vacuum port. And another thing I had to pick up, if you have a newer style GM alternator like I do, because that's from the one down there is from the 2000 Camaro, the Terminator X harness doesn't have a plug that goes down to like a wire that goes down to the alternator to tell it to turn on and start charging. So you'll have to, Holley sells this guy, and there's the part number for that. And that works on the newer style GM alternators, and this just gets wired up to a 12 volt switch power, so like ignition power. So I'll have to run that inside and hook it up to somewhere in the ignition. But that, if you don't already have a way to power up your alternator, you'll need one of those. Okay, skip ahead a couple weeks. I had to stop what I was doing with wiring this up because I ran into some problems. Problems being my limited knowledge of wiring. I had to contact Holley, which was actually really easy. If you have any questions doing this project, a simple email to Holley, and they got back to me within the day, and they were really helpful. So everything's explained in the manual as to how to wire up the engine side of it. And under the dash 2, except for when it gets to the auxiliary inputs and outputs. It's not really that clear, not to me anyway. And for me to wire up everything I need to wire up to make a turbo setup work, it really got foggy in my head when it came to the inputs and outputs. So after talking with Holley, like a representative from Holley, they kind of walked me through it a bit, and I had to pick up a few things, one of which was another transducer, pressure transducer, and that's going to read dome pressure, which I'm not going to get into right now because I don't need that to start the motor. I will need it when it comes time to start making boost. And I also was curious as to how I was going to wire up my max sensor, or max solenoid, to regulate the boost. So I stopped because I didn't want to get too far ahead of myself, and I don't want to have to redo anything. I'm trying my best not to make mistakes while doing this. But after talking and doing lots of reading, I don't really need to worry too much about them right now. There was one I had to wire up, and that was for my fans. I'll show you how I wired it up. Hopefully it works. I'm pretty sure it will work. But for the other stuff, the other inputs, I'm just going to hold off for now. And when I start doing all of my vacuum lines to regulate the boost, then I'll worry about wiring those in. But for now, I'll show you what I did under the dash. So there we have the computer mounted. Above that, I've got 3 relays. With the Holley setup, your green wire is what runs your fuel pump. Now, that wire can only handle, and it tells you right in the manual, you can't run a fuel pump that draws more than 15 amps. If you do, you need to use this as your trigger wire on another relay, and then run, which one was it? See this wire here? I ran a 10 gauge all the way back, down through the floor, up out the back, and into the trunk to my fuel pump, because I have a Walboro 525 that draws 24 amps at peak power, I read. So this wire was not going to be strong enough. You'll just burn it up. So I wired in a relay just for that. These other 2 relays are for my fan, and these are the auxiliary wires. There's 8 wires that come out of a plug. These are what's going to run my my boost controller and dome pressure sensor. So I got a little bit more research to do on that before I wire those in. But I got the one, and it tells you right in the book, there's 2, the first 2 auxiliaries are for the fan, but you can relabel them inside the computer to run whatever you want apparently. But the first one I left is for the fan, and it tells you it's the gray wire with the yellow stripe, which I have up in here. And that's going to trigger both these relays to come on for my fans. If you don't have a fuse block like this in your car, I would recommend putting one in, because it made wiring everything a lot easier to have all these extra fusible ports to hook into. Other than that, if you read the instructions, it pretty much tells you to do, like, how to do everything. Here's my yellow wire from my alternator. I have it coming up, hooked into a power source. This is an ignition power from my steering column, and I have both the ignition power for the computer and the ignition signal for the alternator. So it took me a little bit to get it all figured out, just because I'm not too strong with wiring, but I got it done. And now, if I key it on, the computer lights up, the screen lights up, and now I have to go through the setup that it basically walks you through how to set everything up. I'm not going to do it tonight because I'm not quite ready to get involved with this yet, and it says at the end, it asks you to start it, and I'm not ready to start it yet, but I am shortly. So again, this isn't a how-to video on how to install a Terminator X. This is just my experience on what I've run into so far. And if my experiences can rub off on you guys and it'll speed up your installation process, then great. That's the goal of this. And you know, I'm just a normal guy with some car knowledge. But if you can learn anything from this, great. If you have any advice for me, feel free to comment, because I'm no pro. And I'm sure I'm gonna make mistakes. I have made some mistakes already. But it's all about learning, right? And having fun in the end. So next video, I'm hoping to have this thing ready to fire up, because I'm really close. I just got to finish a few things under the car, like my transmission cooler lines, and then we're pretty much ready to rock. Throw a little bit of coolant in it, and I think we'll be good to go. Hopefully I wired everything right. Hopefully I plumbed everything right. Hopefully everything's bolted down properly. We shall find out really, really soon. Hopefully in the next video.